Trump will do whatever it takes to retain power.
Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza, and this is my co-host, Alana Sivan. Friday, everyone, October 30th. That means there are just 4 days left until the end of voting. Now, the election has been going on now for weeks. November 3rd is election day, but that doesn't mean that's when the election starts or ends. That just happens to be the last day of voting. Now, this day, of course, plays a pivotal role in determining who becomes the next president or who wins a ton of other races. And it's not by any means the end of the election. In America, elections are supposed to sort of end when all the votes are counted and the result is determined accordingly. It's funny. It's a point I am surprised to find myself making more and more these days. It's seemingly controversial that we count the votes to get to the result. We don't pick a result and then just kind of hope the votes match or stop counting entirely because we already picked. Got to count the votes to find out who won. Donald Trump would, of course, prefer that we just decide he won and not count the votes, maybe throw them somewhere behind a supermarket and light them on fire. This year, though, it looks like there's going to be a lot of votes to count, making everything more complicated, slower, and causing us to have to brace for perhaps more than just 1 or 2 days of counting. So at this point, as we are speaking right now, more than 85 million ballots have already been cast. That is more than 60% of the entire amount of votes that were cast in 2016. And we're still 4 days out. We're still 4 days out from the end of voting. So Texas, right now, has already surpassed its entire 2016 vote count in early voting alone. Among these 85 million votes, though, are around 55 mail-in ballots that have already been returned. So they are safe, but we'll go into that more later. I may have just picked a funny word for that. But what we're very concerned about are these tens of millions of ballots that are still out there floating around in the ether, sitting on someone's dining room table, meaning people have either not filled them out or are waiting to go vote in person. Here's what this means from the perspective of getting your vote counted. If you have one of those ballots sitting in your living room, up on your fridge, still in your car, I don't know, it is too late to use the mail. You can no longer fill it out and drop it in the postal service. You have to either take it to a drop-off site, ASAP, fill it out, take it to a drop-off site, or make plans to vote early in person. Now, that means you could go today if you're on the West Coast, only 1 p.m. out there. You can go over the weekend, you can go Monday, or you can actually choose to show up on election day. Different states may have different rules about whether you need to physically surrender the ballot you already got in order to be able to vote in person. So all of this is to say, go on the internet, double check your state's procedures, follow them. If you haven't voted yet, honestly, don't watch the rest of this show. Don't hang out with us. Go vote, get it done, and don't let there be any chance of a mistake in getting your vote counted.
Exactly. This show is recorded. You can watch it after you vote. So go away, go do that. But what's even more important than voting, believe it or not, actually voting is very important, but and we need to make sure that our votes are counted. And that normally seems like a given, right? We're supposed to have free and fair elections in this democracy, but there is a clear assault on mail-in ballots in this country. And that's why we started the show, The Count, because it's clear that Trump and his GOP allies don't want mail-in ballots to count. They don't want our votes and our voices to count in this election. And in fact, they appear to be engaged in a really desperate plot to steal this election by throwing out mail-in ballots and undermining the will of the people. State Republicans and the courts have already signaled their willingness to go along with Trump's plan to steal this election, to have mail-in ballots discounted. And we have to make sure that we don't let this happen and don't let Trump sneak his way into an illegitimate second term.
Yep. So over the next 4 days and beyond that, we fully expect that Donald Trump and his Republican enablers are going to continue to aggressively pursue every possible means to bring their plot to fruition. The scary thing is that right now it's really hard to predict how successful they might be in carrying out all of these different strategies that have one central theme, which is throwing out enough votes to get Donald Trump within cheating distance of a victory. If you're like me, and sometimes read history books and think like, God, I wonder what it would have been like to be there, right before the fall of the regime. You're in a really weird place right now because, you look outside, it's a fairly normal October day, unless you're in the hurricane or the snowstorm that are happening today. But, you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you're living your life. It doesn't feel like we're on the verge of a slow motion coup, but in fact, this is what it feels like right before the decisive moment, a moment that could completely transform the life of our nation, our form of government. It's a make or break moment for democracy. And it's hard to get to that place of emotional resonance and urgency, but we must, because that's really what we're facing down. We've heard from many people over the last few weeks who told us that they don't just think this is perhaps the most important election of our lifetimes. It's the first time that we as a people have really had to face such a stark choice between democracy and autocracy. And we're all going to have to band together pretty hard and make that choice for ourselves by November 3rd. If all of our voices are heard, the choice will probably be clear. But this year, as Alana mentioned, we've got to do more than just choose. We are fighting the fight to defend our choice, to defend our votes, to defend the protections we enjoy as citizens, as Donald Trump and his Republican teammates try everything in the litigation playbook to undermine the will of the people. And to defend against that scenario, we have to be prepared. That's why we're trying to make sure you are prepared when the time comes.
And we are so excited today to talk with an expert who is going to help us prepare for all of these potential scenarios. Today we have Professor Franita Tolson, a Vice Dean and Professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law and author of the forthcoming book, In Congress We Trust, Enforcing Voting Rights from the Founding to the Jim Crow Era. She is also a fellow with the Justice Collaborative Institute. Professor Tolson, thanks so much for joining us today.
Very happy to be here, Alana and Emily. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start out with a quick caveat, which is that there is a world, and it's a beautiful world, where there are no nightmare scenarios, where everything works out, where all of the votes are counted and everything we've been talking about for the past few weeks is irrelevant. And I hope we live in that world. But a lot of things could come to play, and a lot of things have to happen for these different sorts of nightmare scenarios that we've talked about to play out, to come to fruition. Can you talk a little bit about what would have to happen for Donald Trump to be able to carry out this scheme that he has made apparent to bring himself to an illegitimate second term?
So thank you for the question. I think we need to move the baseline a little bit, though. Let me invite you to think about this as we're kind of living the nightmare already a little bit. And the question is whether or not the nightmare will be outcome determinative. So let me explain what I mean by that. People are waiting in line for hours to vote, right? We're well into early voting and lines are still long in a lot of places. There's been a number of cases in which courts have not sided with the voters, right? They have sided in favor of laws. They make it more difficult to vote in the middle of a global pandemic. So really for me, the question is whether or not these decisions and this reality will have some effect on the outcome next Tuesday. And I don't know, right? So there are still things that have to happen for us to be at a point where our democracy is about to go off the precipice. So for example, if in Pennsylvania, which has gotten a lot of attention and rightfully so, if Pennsylvania is the state that this all comes down to, let me just say we're in trouble, right? Pennsylvania has very poor infrastructure when it comes to accommodating the volume of mail-in ballots. And also the Trump campaign has litigated there extensively because they realize that it's likely that all roads go through Pennsylvania. So we're at a point where election officials there are already segregating ballots that they'll start segregating ballots after election day because those ballots might not count depending on the litigation, right? So we're at a point where I think it's kind of nightmare, right? And I want to emphasize that because after Tuesday, let's continue the conversation about how to fix this, right? But there are some things that can happen, particularly if we don't have an outcome out of Pennsylvania in the coming days and the rhetoric gets ratcheted up and the president starts shouting and tweeting and claiming that the election is rigged. Yeah, that's a problem. And to me, that is the true nightmare scenario and something that we should definitely be concerned about.
So you were recently interviewed and you said that Trump's end goal in challenging the ballots was to question the legitimacy of the election. And Professor Tolson, I'm wondering, pretty much every statement he's made that I've noticed in the last couple of weeks has been questioning the legitimacy of the election. And I'm wondering to what extent you think he's already accomplished that goal and why that goal is so essential to what he would like to do next.
I do think he's accomplished it to some extent. So you can tell by the difference between Republicans and Democrats and their willingness to vote by mail, right? Far fewer Republicans are voting by mail this cycle, in part because of the president's comments. So it's definitely resonating in a way that is counterproductive, right? The idea is for people to vote. I care about people voting. I don't care who they vote for. And so he's actually, in my view, harming his own supporters by making them feel like the system is insecure and that voting by mail is no longer safe. But I think part of the goal is that he's created this narrative that works for him no matter what happens. So if he wins, he can say, look, I overcame all of this fraud and I was still able to pull it out, right? But if he loses, he can say, well, Joe Biden is not the rightful president because of the fraud that kept me from winning. Right. So no matter what, it's win-win for him. And that's the whole point of calling into the legitimacy of the election, because even if he's the winner, he can still paint a picture of him overcoming any potential fraud and legitimacy concerns.
So dipping into what you just said and focusing on the chaos element and also putting on my tinfoil hat, I wanted to talk with you about some of the more extreme fears that people have, particularly about a situation where the outcome of a vote count, say in a state like Pennsylvania, is so much in question that there could be a disagreement between the governor and the legislature about which slate of electors to send to the Electoral College. Of course, what we're talking about in this scenario is the idea that Donald Trump claims the votes can't be counted, it's all too tainted, it's all too fraudulent. The Republican legislature of Pennsylvania sends Trump electors to the Electoral College. The governor sends Biden electors to the Electoral College, or wants to simply wait and try to keep counting the votes. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this scenario, the potential for this type of contested election, and how that could spark chaos, violence. What other outlandish things could happen that I'm not thinking of here?
Okay, so I've actually been thinking through this scenario quite a bit because in my heart of hearts, I feel like it's the crisis nightmare, like, oh my God, American democracy. But in some ways, the system is kind of set up to handle this in a way that I think is good. So it's good that, this has happened in the past and we've had legislative changes to address this possibility, right? So if it happens, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of America because it's happened before. But at the same time, it does signal something about where we are. Right. So you can imagine a situation where after Election Day, the Pennsylvania legislature calls into question the outcome of the election. They say that we're not sure who won because there's so much fraud. Right. And so we're going to appoint a slate of electors, which is something that technically federal law provides for. Right. A failure to elect, the state legislature can then come in and appoint a slate of electors. But then let's say that election officials in Pennsylvania certify a winner. The governor signs off and that slate goes. So now you have two slates before Congress. The law is actually set up to sort of mediate that dispute, right? So both houses would have to weigh in independently on which slate is the right slate. If they can't agree, the executive of the state, normally the governor, will decide which slate is the valid slate. So technically, if we get to that unlikely scenario, there's an end goal in sight, right? So now I think if we get to that point, the real fear people have is about the potential for violence, right? The potential for massive unrest, because all eyes will be on whatever state is the center of the dispute. Both sides will be passionate and worked up about it, and so even if there's a statutory structure in place that can mediate this dispute, it still can't control for popular passions in a way that I think does concern many, many people.
I have a few questions, and
Okay.
sometimes I ask wonky questions, so forgive me if they're a little too wonky. So you talk about how there's this mechanism
Mhm.
in the law to deal with this sort of scenario. I'm sort of wondering, because we've heard a lot of different interpretations of how that scenario must be interpreted and how it's supposed to be dealt with. And I'm also curious to talk a little bit about, in the past, how certain norms have played into the way that it's interpreted and the way that candidates have handled it. If you could talk a little bit about those two things.
Okay, so I think those are very important questions because it may also explain why people still feel panicked despite this mechanism, right? It's a part of something called the Electoral Count Act of 1887. It is terribly written. It's an awful statute. And so what that does is it leaves room for a lot of different interpretations. When it says that there's a failure to elect that allows the state legislature to make this decision about a new slate of electors, what does failure to elect mean, right? Is it enough for the state legislature to say, oh, we just feel like there's fraud, right? But these are all questions that are unresolved because the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in on them. So I don't mean to suggest that just because there's a mechanism, how that mechanism will be deployed is absolutely certain. It's not. But I do think norms play a very important role in this. For the last, 50 years, at least prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, effectively gutting part of the Voting Rights Act, we were on I think, an upward trajectory towards a more inclusive electorate, broader suffrage. And so because of we were definitely a place where we were evolving towards more democratic norms in the last half century. And so because of that, I think it's hard for an entity like the Pennsylvania State Legislature to step in and say, we're going to disregard the will of the people completely and just replace it with our own slate, right? They will have to come forward with more conclusive evidence that something is actually wrong in order to do that. Because despite the fact that they are making it very, very hard for people to vote in that state, it's a different thing entirely to say, we're just going to disregard the election results completely. So to some extent, even though norms have eroded in recent years, I do think that norm of sort of people voting and choosing their president, even though, they're choosing a slate of electors, people think that they're choosing the president. And so it's really, really hard to go against that. And so to some extent, that's still a constraint on political actors, even political actors who are not necessarily acting in good faith.
It's really funny you mentioned that because it sort of makes me feel like people in power, like not wanting to remind people about the Electoral College because everyone will hate it so much. Like, just don't talk about it. Don't bring it up. Maybe we can keep it if we just put it in the closet. I'm very curious, is there a nightmare scenario that you think has gone undernoticed and has not been talked about enough in the media and on shows like this?
The interesting thing is we've spent a disproportionate amount of time on nightmare scenarios. I have spent a ton of the summer and early fall gaming out potential doomsday scenarios. And I think in part, a lot of it has to do with just the rhetoric around this election. A lot of it has to do with the fact that for years, states, particularly states in the South, have been taking steps to make it more difficult for people to vote. Like everything we're living through right now is not a product of 2020. I know we have murder hornets and a pandemic and all these other things, but this was actually something that was put in place over a 5, 6, 7-year period where states reduced polling sites, put in place more restrictive voter ID laws, passed a series of measures to make it more difficult to vote. And it's just bearing fruit in 2020. And so I think because of that, I don't know if there's a particular nightmare scenario that's going overlooked because we have spent a lot of time, probably 90% of our attention has went to things that have a less than 1% chance of actually happening. Right. Even like Pennsylvania, I have talked about Pennsylvania for weeks and weeks and weeks. But if the polls hold, Pennsylvania won't even be close. Right. There was a decision that came out of the 8th Circuit this week, Minnesota, which, the 8th Circuit said that Minnesota has to basically segregate ballots received after Election Day. And they hinted that those ballots will be thrown out. And so like these are all disastrous decisions to me, particularly since people are mailing in their ballots in Minnesota with the understanding that they had until the 10th, I believe, and now they only have until the 3rd. And today is October 30th, right? So this goes back to my earlier point about us living in the nightmare. Like in many ways, we are living through some of these nightmare scenarios, but the true nightmare scenario, right? Where in 1876, you almost had dueling inaugurations, right? 2 days before the inauguration was when the president was picked because it was a contested election. I don't think that we'll end up there, but that is probably the true nightmare scenario that has the least likelihood of coming to fruition.
Mm. Huh. We
Sorry,
have a lot.
Alana's going to show a different kind of nightmare.
Oh, I'm ready. But it is well, we're going to show you a clip.
Okay.
It is just brace yourself because you've probably already seen it already, but every time I watch it, it's from the Donald Trump campaign, and it's quite problematic. So let's play it quickly.
The radical left are laying the groundwork to steal this election from my father, President Donald Trump. They are planting stories that President Trump will have a landslide lead on election night, but will lose when they finish counting the mail-in ballots. Their plan is to add millions of fraudulent ballots that can cancel your vote and overturn the election. We cannot let that happen. We need every able-bodied man, woman to join Army for Trump's election security operation at defendyourballot.com. We need you to help us watch them, not just on election day, but also during early voting and at the counting boards. President Trump is going to win. Don't let them steal it. Go to defendyourballot.com and enlist today.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the music, the message, and
The
particularly
camera angle, the hotel room.
well, and particularly there is such a thing as a poll watcher, a valid poll watcher who goes to sort of, with the clipboards and they're going to problem shoot and all of that, or troubleshoot and all of that. But what he is recruiting for and the tone of what he's recruiting for is quite different from that. Can you talk to us a little bit about why this is different from the traditional poll watcher?
Right. So a traditional poll watcher is pretty well regulated by state law. Like state law often requires people to get training. They require them to identify themselves either through like a badge or something. Poll watchers can be selected through party officials. You can have non-partisan poll watchers. It varies by state, but I think the basic point is that it is regulated usually. And a part of it is to make sure that poll watching doesn't descend into voter intimidation or voter interference. And so the risk of that type of message is that you have everyday people who don't have the requisite training, who was not selected as a poll watcher, thinking they could just go to the polls to watch. And then it turns into a situation in which voters feel intimidated. And so the real danger of that is that it invites the type of chaos that people are concerned about. It invites a kind of violence that could result in a disruption of both voting and the counting of the ballots. And so it's very dangerous because you have to be careful. You don't want people thinking that this is something that they can just do on their own volition without any type of oversight. It's not.
It's such disturbing language to me. We had Donnie Fowler on the show to talk about the Gore campaign. And we were talking about the concession. And he said, what was Al Gore supposed to do? Raise an army? And it's really kind of amazing to me that we're in a moment now where Donald Trump is using this language. He is raising an army. He is asking people to enlist. And I think what's interesting to me is, as we talk through all of these different scenarios, which, as you mentioned, like 90% of the time, we're talking about the 1% nightmare scenario, because they are so frightening. And I think we're also sort of struggling with the cognitive dissonance of most people in this country having been conditioned to feel that they live in a stable representative democracy, which is not necessarily like a safe assumption in a world where countries don't often last this long. And, there is upheaval. And we even, as a nation, have a history of tremendous upheaval and tremendous flaws in our system, many of which are deliberately constructed. It's just astonishing to me because people have such short memories. I mean, even Bush v. Gore 20 years ago seems to have slipped through the cracks for a lot of people. And I'm wondering if you could talk with us, Professor, about why folks have this confidence in the incredible durability they assume that our democracy has, and whether that is misplaced at this moment.
It's always misplaced, if I can be frank. Democracy in this country has always been an aspirational project. It's never something that you reach, though. It's always something you're fighting to preserve. And to me, that's okay, right? It's okay that we never actually reach 100% democracy, because then you start to take it for granted and then you lose it. It's something we always have to fight for. But people do get comfortable. And the reality of the situation is that there's always people in this country who democracy does not work for, always. So that means that it is always an ongoing battle, because just because you vote, like I live in California, I mean, voting for me is easy. But that does not mean that I am absolved of my responsibility to fight on behalf of others who might not be able to vote with such ease, because I fundamentally believe voting should not be difficult. But this is how we cabin trauma, right? We don't like to remember the things that led up to the civil rights movement. I was thinking yesterday about the fact that on Emmett Till's 79th birthday, that him and my mom are the same age, but we treat that as if it was just another lifetime, and it's beyond the capacity of modern Americans living currently to really conceive of such a horrible time in our country. It was not that long ago. But it's important to have these reminders, because it makes us realize that this is a thing that can slip away in an instant. And that's why Tuesday feels so consequential, right? It feels like such a consequential election, in part because it's a referendum on where we are as a democracy. It's a test. Either we passed the test or we failed the test. And I don't think that people are prepared for failure, because they've taken success for granted, to the extent where they've even manufactured the success. I would contend that we've never been quite successful, that it's always been a work in progress.
You know, it's really interesting to hear you talk about both, we're in the nightmare scenario right now. We've been in a nightmare scenario for a very long time. But at the same time, there are elements of success that we have within this democracy that we also have to preserve. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how we not only preserve those elements of success, but also push to get out of the nightmare scenario that we've been in even before Trump, even before, the voter nightmare scenario all around.
So, I love your framing, Alana, in part because it does set up why people have cognitive dissonance. Because if you focus on the success, you can ignore the failures. If you focus on your own personal situation, you can ignore the people who are getting left behind. But it's really important to be holistic. One of the things that has come out of this election is that when people feel like they are under siege and being threatened, they pay attention, right? And that kind of scares me a little bit, because I don't want it to be like us to be at, code red all the time in order for people to pay attention to politics and the right to vote. But it does speak to the need for more voter engagement, for more civic education around voting and elections, for people to be more invested in state and local elections. It's not just the president that's on the ballot on Tuesday, right? It's school boards, it's, state legislatures. The big story out of Texas is not necessarily that Biden might win, right? The big story out of Texas is they might flip the Texas House. That's huge, right? That is a 20-year gerrymander. And so I think in some ways we have to broaden our lens. And the question is, how do we continue to do that past Tuesday? How do we continue to keep people engaged? How do we get to a point where we don't get back here again, right? It's one thing to say that democracy is this aspirational project, but it's another thing to let it slip away so much that we get to a point where we almost lose it completely. I just don't want to get back here. I'm okay with fighting, but this moment where honestly, I haven't slept in days because I'm like, okay, what's going to happen next week, right? I don't want to get back here, and I think part of that is realizing that on Wednesday morning we wake up and we keep fighting, right? We keep trying to figure out ways to keep young people engaged. Turnout among young people is has skyrocketed this year. How can we maintain that? How can we preserve that? It shouldn't feel like an existential crisis that motivates people to the polls. People should be motivated to go to the polls because, one, people die for the privilege of them to be able to vote, but also, two, because it matters. Voting is just as important as turning out in the streets, right? With the murder of George Floyd, you had some of the largest global protests that this world has seen. My hope is that we can have that same motivation without something tragic spurring it along, that it just comes because people care and they're invested and they realize that the only way to hold elected officials accountable is to either vote them in or vote them out. They should not win by default.
The collective hiring and firing power that we hold. I think people often forget that, right? That it's like, you hate your school board chair? Great. You actually can fire them with your neighbors and hire a new one. And here's all the people that are contending for your attention. And why it is so dangerous when we enter a world in which those people entrenched in power are untethered from the power of the voters. I mean, when Donald Trump is immune to being fired, we're in deep trouble. But since we are almost at the end of our segment, I wanted to ask you something. And since you are sleep deprived, maybe loopy enough to really go all in on this question. Here we go. You get to design the new Voting Rights Act. What do you put in place?
Ooh.
I thought you'd like this one. I thought you'd enjoy it.
So I did testify before the House Judiciary Committee with respect to the current proposal out there. It's not big enough, right? One of the problems is that the Congress is really constrained by the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court's view of what it can do, of what Congress can do. And so the current proposal would only cover, 4 or 5 states who have committed recent violations. The beauty of it is that it applies nationwide, right? So if you have a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania that commits voting rights violations, they qualify to be bailed in under this new Voting Rights Act. But I think we need to go bigger. So one of the things that I've been working on with Senators Durbin and Warren is a right to vote amendment, right? It would create an affirmative right to vote in our Constitution. That is like my holy grail, right? Because it would keep the things that's happening in Pennsylvania with the absentee ballots would not be okay. The thing that happened in Minnesota that I was talking about earlier would not be okay, right? It would create a blueprint for what the right to vote requires, as opposed to thinking about what state legislatures can and cannot do, which is actually a different question. And let me explain, right? Because if we say that as a voter, you are entitled to, the state has to do these 3 things to make it easier for you to vote, right? Like if the state has a voter ID law, they have to actually come forward with evidence of fraud in order to justify that voter ID law. It's not a situation of whether the state's power is broad enough and it permits them to enact a voter ID law. It's whether or not, does this voter ID law infringe on the right to vote such that it's not justified and the state cannot do it? That's what I mean by it's 2 different questions, right? It puts the focus on the right to vote and takes the focus off of state power, right? That is where we are. A lot of the disputes that we've seen in recent days in the courts over absentee ballots have been about battles between the state legislature and other organs of the state, right? The voters have been completely left out of this. If you look at some of the recent Supreme Court decisions, the question is, okay, is it okay for the federal court to adopt a remedy that allows absentee ballots to be received 3 days after Election Day instead of on Election Day, or does that violate the power of the state legislature? What about the voters, right? What about the fact that people are voting in the middle of a global pandemic? Why doesn't that matter? Right? Why isn't that a fact that a federal court or a state Supreme Court can take notice of? Why is everything about the power of the state? So if we had an actual amendment in the Constitution that provided for an affirmative right to vote, that put a vision of what voting requires out there, that would go a long way towards achieving everything that I could hope for. That, along with civic engagement and educating the public and keeping people engaged, I think that we would earn our title of a democracy. Because right now, this ain't it.
Professor, please run for office and introduce this bill. We will all volunteer for you. And thank you so much for your time today. It's really been a pleasure.
Of course. Thank you.
I really love the framework she just described. Like I'm gonna it was so cool and smart that I'm gonna just repeat it mindlessly now. The idea that you could force the government to consider whether an action takes away your right to vote, instead of considering whether this is a legitimate state rule based on their efficiency and the possibility of fraud. Like, just make it simple. Does this hurt the people's right to vote? And if it does, you can't do it. Like, I love things that are simple. I love things that are simple and pro-people.
Because right now, voting is treated like a privilege.
Yeah.
It's treated like a privilege and not a right, which creates this electorate that we have that benefits people with privilege.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, it's the Steve Bannon thing. When he was talking, he's like, well, sure, you can vote if you check all the boxes and jump through all of the hoops and all of that. It's like, no, the whole point is that by virtue of being a citizen here, you get to vote.
Exactly. And it was so interesting for me to hear her talk about, I mean, there were just so many interesting things to talk about. First, hearing about the possibility of this 1% nightmare scenario coming to fruition. That was really interesting for me to hear about, because I think about, it's kind of the focus of a lot of what we've been talking about. It's very unlikely to happen, although it really could happen, and Trump is going to try. But also, it really sort of illuminated for me how much work we still have to do, and how much work we still had to do even before Trump was in office, to make voting accessible to everyone and to really solidify voting as a right, and again, not a privilege.
Well, that's the thing, right? Is of all the constitutional amendments we could go for, this could be the most meaningful and also the hardest to criticize. Like, this seems, I mean, if we're all pretending that we all want a democracy, we all kind of have to get on board.
But you know what would happen? I can bet you that the sort of opposition that would come to this is, oh, the states are just going to like jump over hoops to make sure that we get voter fraud. That's what's going to happen. That's going to be what people are going to be saying. Or excuse me, not people, what the GOP and Trump enablers are going to be saying. And that's really a shame. And I hope that sort of like Professor Tolson was saying, that everything that has been happening will wake people up to realize how important it is to preserve our democracy, but also how much work we have to do, which will then hopefully shift this mindset where we're okay with elected officials trying to discount our votes.
Yeah. It's funny. It's in our field, Alana, that people feel so comfortable to just like throw caution to the wind and make claims that are completely without evidence, right? Like voter fraud, what they did in every review, it's like somewhere between 0.00016 and 0.00025% of cases. I mean, it's like voter fraud is non-existent. But like all things that intersect with transgression and criminality, people feel comfortable trusting their gut of like, how much are we worried about this, over the actual evidence of how much does this thing happen.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Professor Tolson 2024, and now for our next segment.
I'm volunteering, I'm ready.
Although I'm excited that she's already working on this stuff now, and I'm gonna key my hopes in on that cool amendment. So, all right, we are all talking a lot about Pennsylvania. Professor Tolson mentioned that she'd been talking about Pennsylvania for like 3 days without sleeping. It could be the make or break state of this election. Perhaps Pennsylvania will be the state to decide whether we get to continue down the path of having a representative form of government. So Trump and his Republican allies have been, of course, fighting dirty, trying to get an advantage in this state and in this battleground, and looking for any way possible to throw out as many legitimate ballots as possible and casting as much doubt on the counting process as possible. Earlier this week, we had some back and forth with the Supreme Court over the last 2 weeks. And earlier this week, the Supreme Court declined to act on a GOP-led challenge on the state's mail-in voting process, meaning ballots postmarked by Election Day in Pennsylvania and received up to 3 days later, right now, can still be counted. I would like to note that in all of these states, we're seeing them do the incredibly unfair thing of like changing the rules every 5 minutes on people. So I say right now, meaning like, don't rely on those 3 days. Get your ballot in right now. But technically, according to the Supreme Court, minus Amy Coney Barrett, who did not partake in the case because she didn't have time to do the reading, right now there's still a 3-day grace period.
Right. And, you know, as stressful as it is to say it's likely going to come down to Pennsylvania. And, you know, and Professor Tolson told us about how that's really stressful because a lot of their systems are not great. And we've seen some pockets of early voting energy, which is exciting to see, especially in places like Philadelphia. But statewide voting numbers are actually pretty low. And that could change as mail-in ballots are counted in and returned and tabulated. But for now, it's looking like Election Day could swing the momentum in one way or the other. So to get caught up on all the latest news out of the Keystone State, we spoke yesterday with Pennsylvania State Representative Jonna McClinton, the first Black woman to be elected as the House Democratic Caucus chairperson. We're going to play that interview for you now and then come back to wrap it up.
Representative, thank you so much for joining us. And we want to start with the big news of the day. So in a decision yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a second attempt by Pennsylvania Republicans to block an extended ballot deadline, which allows your state, of course, to count votes, count received ballots, received up to 3 days after the election in a state with massively not on time mail right now. So can you give us your response to that decision and also explain why your Republican colleagues seem so intent on finding a way to throw out so many ballots?
So first of all, it is great to be here with you two this afternoon. And let me just say, it is very clear from every lawsuit that has been filed all year by either the president or his campaign or the Pennsylvania Republican Party that they want to steal the election. They do not want Pennsylvania voters to have their voices heard, which is supposed to happen in our democracy. Unfortunately, they have shown that over and over again. And so what I have been encouraging all of my neighbors to do is ensure that they drop it off at one of our several locations where you can drop off your ballot, where it is counted not counted, but what's officially received within 24 to 48 hours. So there are as few issues that they can claim on, because even the United States Supreme Court has said that they don't have legs for this current stance that they're trying to continuously do.
Representative, Pennsylvania has always been a really pivotal state in elections. And right now, a lot of people are saying that it could be the make or break state in this election. And we've seen sort of a mixed bag in terms of coverage. We've seen that turnout for voting has been phenomenal. But then we've also seen a lot of rhetoric from Donald Trump about Philadelphia, saying that very bad things happen there. And sort of all of these other different sorts of lies that we know don't have real basis. So as somebody who is there, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's actually happening on the ground and to clear the record for those who are unfortunate enough to believe Donald Trump's lies?
Absolutely. So the first and foremost thing is actually in the Pennsylvania legislature, my colleagues in the majority party, the Pennsylvania State House Republicans, have also claimed that there is voter fraud. However, there's no record of voter fraud happening in Philadelphia in the primary that occurred June the 2nd in the last 4 years. It is simply a false claim. It is not true. We are not known for people not being able to have their voice heard. And of course, in Pennsylvania, what is distinct this time is for the first time, we have no excuse mail-in ballots. So many people, including myself, I voted early by mail, have chosen to not stand in a line on election day, but go to an early voting site where I dropped my ballot and got a little sticker that said I voted. And what I have seen is neighbors waiting in long lines to get mail-in ballots printed on the spot, completing them, sending them out. What I have seen is communities getting together, celebrating the right that we all have in this country, 18 years old and over, to lift up our voices and choose the type of leadership we want. And of course, as much as we're focused on the White House, every member of the Pennsylvania State House is on the ballot. So if you go all the way down, or if you have a paper ballot and flip it over, you'll see the people who are running to be members of the Pennsylvania House. And it is important to know that here in Philly, we have not had issues of voter fraud. It is unfortunately a false claim.
So, all right. You mentioned a couple different things, and I am now going to make you do like the informational video for Pennsylvania voters. So if you are someone who had a mail-in ballot and you have your mail-in ballot and you haven't returned it yet, what should you do with that ballot?
So if you are in Pennsylvania, you have your mail-in ballot somewhere on your dining room table, because in the primary, I have to confess, I held on to mine a little bit long. I was getting emails and everything from the Department of State. Dear Joanna McClinton, turn in your ballot. However, you might be like I was earlier this year with the first election cycle and had other things to do and you just hadn't done it. I encourage you not to put it in the mail. Number one, because we have had slow mail showing up, whether you've ordered something from a store or small business owner in the area and it's a little bit delayed, or whether it's just a bill from a municipality, they're all a little bit late. So do not put it in the mailbox. However, whether you're in Delaware County, which is where I also serve, or here in Philadelphia, in the city where I live and serve, there are locations that are official. They have staff. It is not just like a mailbox. In Delaware County, they have cameras. You can drop it off safely and securely at one of those locations. You can go to votespa.com/return my ballot. votespa.com/return my ballot. You can put your address in and they will tell you where the closest location is for you to go. These are official sites. They're not volunteers. They are staffed by professionals, county election official workers, but depending on where you live. You can turn it in that way safely and securely.
Okay, so one follow-up, that's really good to know. So we know that the people there are not like shady weirdos who are just going to steal your ballot and shred it behind a Walmart or something. But let's say that you have your mail-in ballot, but you're like, you know what? I don't trust this whole thing. I really want to vote on election day. I want to show up and vote in person, yet I also have this mail-in ballot. How does somebody transition from one to the other?
Absolutely. So many people have requested the ballots, but rather go the old school way, which is seeing the choice happen in front of your own eyes immediately. That is not a problem. Election day is just a few days away. You can do that Tuesday, November the 3rd. If you're in Pennsylvania and you requested a mail-in ballot, keep all of the contents of that ballot in an envelope. Perhaps the envelope it came in. Don't fill any of it out. Keep it all in that envelope. Take that envelope with you to your polling location. Where I vote, it's an elementary school 2 blocks from my home. And for many of us, our locations are rather close to where we live. But take that ballot to the location, give it to the election board workers and say, I want to vote in person. They will tear up in front of you. And as you witness, they will tear up and destroy your mail-in ballots and allow you to go and use the poll the traditional way.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the recent decisions in Cumberland and Erie counties to delay the counting of mail-in and absentee ballots until after Election Day? Specifically, we know that because mail-in ballots are likely to lean Democratic, this could skew the early results further in Trump's favor. And so wanted to get your opinion on sort of what's going on there.
Absolutely. It's entirely possible that on election night, it may look like, whether it's the president, whether it's Joe Biden, whether it's someone running to be in the Pennsylvania House, it may look as if they're losing and they may begin winning once the ballots are counted. Unfortunately, as much as I urged the Speaker of the House to give us a compromise bill on pre-canvassing, which would have allowed all of the counties across the Commonwealth to at least organize, take the envelopes out, sort, and get them ready to be counted, that legislation did not move. Every time it was offered, it was always cumbered down with, voting disenfranchisement. So I could not vote for it, and those bills did not move. So counties are making their own decisions as to when they're going to start, and it will take at minimum 24 hours at minimum. It is very likely that it could take 48 hours in some counties, depending on how many people they have, opening, sorting, and what type of equipment they have, because it's not uniform. This is the first time mail-in ballot is happening in Pennsylvania as a widespread option, and it used to only be absentee. So there were never thousands and thousands of them. But now that we had that option, and with the pandemic, people have just chosen to be home, to be safe, completed, and submit it back immediately. So we will have a delay in the outcome. However, that does not mean that anyone is able to declare they won, particularly our president, who unfortunately continues to make efforts to silence the democratic process and to almost suffocate the will of the voter. So we have to make sure that we're vigilant, that we're ready, and that we're not accepting any outcomes for our state, unless it's such of a disparity in the numbers, that it's more numbers ahead than there are uncounted ballots. That's the only set of circumstances where we could trust an outcome on Tuesday night, November the 3rd.
Well, so since you brought up this particular president, and it sounds like you also believe that he's going to tweet that he won kind of no matter what at like 10 p.m. on election day. Let's talk about his rhetoric, because recently his rhetoric about Pennsylvania and particularly Philadelphia has gotten especially inflammatory. Seems the closer we get to the election, the more inflammatory he becomes about your state, with comments about, needing to keep a close eye on state Democrats, including the governor, Tom Wolf. He's also continued to recruit an army of poll watchers, encouraged his supporters to be vigilant around polling places. I'm wondering, I'm sure that you all are keeping your polling places safe. And I would love to know both about whether you've seen any potentially concerning or inappropriate behavior from Trump supporters at polling places, but also how officials in Philadelphia or in the rest of the state are preparing to ensure that polling sites feel safe and are safe on election day.
So we will have a few different things happening on election day to keep every voter safe. Unfortunately, the president's words are not just words, and they're not only rhetoric. We see in the very sad case of the plot to kidnap and potentially kill the governor of Michigan as words that are actually very influential. These negative messages are really resonating on people, and they're making poor choices. And their poor choices can put public safety really in jeopardy. So that being said, we are going to have election protection attorneys throughout the state moving around, making sure that people are safe voting. There will be a hotline available that's widely accessible. If you run into anything that's not normal at your polling place, you can call it and report it. Here in Philadelphia, District Attorney Larry Krasner is very, very committed to making sure that all of our voters can vote without any sort of intimidation. And they're going to be handling cases if they do not seem appropriate and someone's in fact breaking the law by harassing, intimidating, threatening someone. And most importantly, our entire government, both here in the city and Delaware County and all throughout this region, we are making sure, no matter what your party affiliation is, no matter who you are voting for, that you have that right and that it's unfettered. When I think about, the great legend of Congressman John Lewis, who was getting into good trouble, this is the time now for everybody who wants every voice, no matter your party, no matter who you're voting for, every voice should be heard, and there should be no limits, no cap, no obstruction to giving you that opportunity. So we are making sure people are safe and secure and able to do so without anyone of that riffraff or any physical threat. We will not be tolerating it whatsoever.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the killing of Walter Wallace. We've seen that this has been another tragedy of a Black man being killed by the police. And, we also know that his family has reported and told us that he suffered from bipolar disorder and was in crisis when police officers shot him. And so some of our viewers might be wondering why this is something we're bringing up right now, because this is sort of a show focused on the presidential election, and policing is normally a local issue. But given the history of this country, the systemic violence brought on Black communities by the police, and the response to protests and uprising against that treatment in the past 5 months, we were hoping you could talk a little bit about what this election means in framing all of that, and also in both locally in Philadelphia and also nationwide, what this election means for the issues of police brutality and systemic racism.
I appreciate you bringing that up. It is a rather timely topic, and of course, an incredibly sad moment in Philadelphia. There has been so much emphasis on race relations, on police brutality, with the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. For that to occur right in the community where I live and serve, like just a couple blocks from my house, a couple blocks the other direction from my district office, it is awful. It's absolutely awful. I have spent some time with the Wallace family over the last few days, giving condolences, giving comfort, giving encouragement, because it's such a tough situation where no matter what you say, it will not change the actions to keep him alive. And that is all I have been sharing. You know, something in that encounter went terribly wrong. No, I have not seen the full incident or the full body camera footage, but I understand soon it will be available to the public. But here's what we all know. When you call for help, you should get help. You should not get any execution. And what we saw is someone calling for help, and someone who, from the vantage point of the public videos we've been able to see, someone who was not coherent, someone who was not saying anything to anybody, in my perspective, almost like a zombie, and really in a serious crisis. So it just saddens our heart to see the Philadelphia police choose a fatal option, as opposed to pepper spray, as opposed to a taser, as opposed to talking, as opposed to allowing the backup that was on the scene to get involved and support this. There's so many other options. So we're working on de-escalation methods. But to get right to your question, in Philadelphia, if you're voting here, we actually have some ballot questions. So this specific issue is on the ballot. We have a question about whether not there should be a citizens police commission that has subpoena power, because we have an advisory board, but it does not have teeth. So look at that question and see how this incident especially helps you make a decision on what we need to demand answers from police. We also have a question about victims of violence and what type of response are needed. But we've also seen, unfortunately, in this administration and directly from the mouth of this president, a lot of play on emphasizing the power that police have to be unchecked. And the thing about government is none of it is unchecked. Whether you're the president, whether you're law enforcement, whether you're in the judiciary, whether you're in the legislative branch, none of the powers that any of us have are unchecked. So it is important to vote your conscience on Tuesday, November the 3rd, or early, of course, with a mail-in ballot if you already have one or ordered one and it's on the way. It's important that you consider everything happening in this nation. Don't just consider political party. Think of tone, think of messaging, because all of that affects everybody, no matter where we are and what we're doing in life, especially members of our law enforcement. And we want to make sure that as much as they and their families want them to be safe, we, the public, want to be safe when we call them for help as well.
Doesn't seem like a lot to ask. All right, so I'd like to turn now to something we've talked about a lot on this show that I think has not been in the center of the national conversation about Pennsylvania, but is very much focused on your state. So there is a mechanism which we have been told the Trump campaign is considering to try and seize victory in spite of the outcome of the election. So in one possible scenario, the GOP-controlled state legislature of Pennsylvania could defy the election results certified by the governor and secretary of state, which would show a Biden victory. So in that scenario, they would simply make the argument, well, there was too much chaos surrounding the count. We don't really think this count is valid. Instead, we're going to assign this slate of Trump electors to the Electoral College. Perhaps if Trump is up on election night and then ballots subsequently counted create a blue shift, they could say, oh, we're going to go with the election day numbers and send a slate of electors for Trump to the Electoral College. Now, this plan is brazen. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was really taken aback by the brazenness of the action that would be required from Republican state legislators. We heard from, another political expert a few days ago on the show that he didn't believe Republican state legislators would be brazen enough to do something like this. Other experts, Bart Gellman, think that they might. You actually know these people. You actually know the people we're speculating about. So do you think that your Republican colleagues would be brazen enough to try something like that?
So I can not only suspect what they might do, but I can tell you that the saying is, the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. The past behavior in the last 30 days has been legislative efforts to close early voting centers, to get rid of drop box locations, and to disenfranchise people. So do I think that my Republican colleagues will make continued efforts to disenfranchise people and silence their votes and try to give the president the election? Sadly, yes, I do. However, my colleagues and I, my constituents, we are prepared to rally, to march, to make sure that nothing like that occurs on our watch, because we are not asleep at the wheel. Our eyes are wide open, and it's more important now than ever to make sure that this is a clear, transparent process. We are not doing anything that is shady, and we're not going to allow them to do anything that is shady to silence people's voices. These are people in Pennsylvania. They have a voice and should speak up and choose what the majority of those voters want. Those are the electors who should be appointed.
Talk to us about some of the response tactics that you're all organizing to make sure happen in case that happens. Are there going to be strikes, rallies, and what do you recommend legislators who are sort of in similar positions as you are in other states to?
Absolutely. Oh, excuse me for interrupting. Absolutely.
No,
so
I'm
if
done.
you are in a swing state, or if you're in a similar situation, then you must make every effort to also be determined to make sure every vote is counted, that it's a transparent process. Not only do we have poll watchers that you get county certificates for where you live, but you can observe the count. You can observe them counting. Any person who's a registered voter can sign up to observe the counting process. And in terms of tactics, we are prepared to have a legal defense fund. We are prepared to get the courts involved. We are prepared to organize our voters, to mobilize them so that they can uplift their voices. If there's anything that's clear, 5 months. For 5 months, people in Philadelphia have been marching, demanding police reform and accountability. So those same folks who live here and march on those issues will be prepared to do the same if anything happens with this election that is not clear and upfront.
That's very encouraging. I'm especially interested in the fact that anyone can just walk in and watch the count. That seems really cool. I know that that would definitely be something I would want to go do with my friends and family. So thank you so much for joining us, for educating our listeners. We really, really hope everything goes smoothly for the next week or so and beyond. So we wish you the very best of luck. We're so grateful to have spent this time with you, and we hope to see you back here again soon, but ideally not because the show is still necessary, ideally just to talk about something interesting.
I look forward to that next topic. Thank you.
Thank you. So Emily, there are a few things that I want to sort of dig into here. So first, let's talk about the reality of voting. One thing that she said was, despite all of these claims that bad things happen in Philadelphia, that's where voting is really high, great turnout. That's a good thing, Donald Trump, not a bad thing. But what is a little bit concerning is that statewide, even though there are these phenomenal turnout rates in Philadelphia, not as high. And so my mic just fell off. I'm just going to clip that back on right now.
It happened to me 2 days ago. It's going around.
I know. It's like you passed it to me. And so the other thing that I want to note, looking at these two interviews side by side, we just spoke with Professor Tolson today, and she has a good amount of faith in the legislators in Pennsylvania, or some amount of faith in the legislators there, thinking that, we have been through this before, and given that we have laws to address the way that a contested election is handled, maybe the point where Republican legislators were saying, no, we're not going to go that far, is flat out discounting the vote of the people. Representative McClinton, who we talked to yesterday, isn't so sure of that. And so given that there is so much on the line in this election, it's going to be really interesting and really anxiety inducing, to be perfectly honest, to see what these legislators will do. And I think this will be a really good test for democracy here, and specifically for GOP legislatures in states that are pivotal in this election. What will they value more? Their party's agenda or preserving our democracy and preserving the will of the people. What do you think about that?
You know, it's interesting to me because, I mean, what's troubling is that the person who actually knows them thinks they would go along with a truly shocking, democracy-ending plan to subvert the will of the people. To me, it all comes down to political butt covering. And what I mean by that is, like, if these people feel that their voters, their populace, they're like the grocer they go to, their name, like the people, will not accept such corruption to a degree that will actually damage the state economy. I mean, like strikes. I mean, like if there is the feeling that taking such extreme action would not only cost them their jobs, it would cost them the stability of their state economically. Because clearly we live in a nation where nobody cares about violence. Everything should be nonviolent and money is what matters. I hate to be that frank about it, but I think that all they really care about is the economy of the state.
You know, Emily, that kind of brings me back to one of our earlier episodes where we spoke with Kiffa and Hardy, who talked about how when you're organizing against these sorts of subversions of democracy, you have to let legislators know that there is a cost for messing with the will of the people. There is a cost. You can't just go, if you do this, we will make life difficult for you and for your election.
It is exactly like training a puppy, or in some instances, a toddler. I speak from experience in both. It is like this. As long as they are counting the ballots, as long as they are doing what they need, as long as we are counting to get to a result, not deciding the result and then stopping the count, but counting to get to a result, all reward. Everything is great. If we're counting, beautiful. Nobody needs to do anything but hang tight, let the count happen. But they do need to know that if they stop the count, if they try to pull something super shady that will result in an Electoral Count Act situation, then you get the spray of water to the face. What is the spray of water to the face? In this case, I think the spray of water to the face really has to involve strikes and boycotts in addition to peaceful protesting. That is just that's from everything we've heard over the last couple of weeks, like that's my takeaway. But I also think it's interesting, right? Because what we heard today from Professor Tolson, she reminded me of something that a lot of people have been saying, which is that democracy is a verb. We do not have really a perfect representative form of government. We have been trying to make it perfect in order to become a more perfect union. We've been trying to do that for over 200 years, sometimes better than others. But the fight, the emphasis from a lot of folks who are steeped in this, that the fight does not end on Wednesday, even if there is a Biden victory. I guess what I'm thinking about is that, like, sometimes we go so into the rabbit hole of if there is electoral theft and we do need to take to the streets to create pressure to spray Republican state legislators in the face with a water bottle. That fight is really obvious and I think really easy for people to understand. But a Biden victory is like fighting for the chance to continue to improve our democracy, right? If we see a Trump victory or a Trump theft, we don't get that chance. I mean, with the Supreme Court as it stands, with continued breaking of norms, with the rule of law no longer in place, we don't get the chance anymore to continue to fight for our democracy. So what's at stake here is the chance to continue the fight that Professor Tolson talked about. And I think that's what's freaking me out, is that all of that protest isn't just for the outcome of the election. It's for being able to continue to fight at all.
You know, when you say it like that, it makes the fight seem at times, and sorry to end on kind of a glum note, a little bit insurmountable. Because I think, you know, we also talked about the shooting of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia. And I think a lot of us can remember even during Obama marching against the same thing. And so when we talk about the fact that we always have to perfect this democracy, it's a lot of work. And it was a lot of work before Trump. And it's that much more work right now. So if you
wait, Alana, I'm not going to let you end on such a glum note. I'm not going to let you. But wait,
thank you.
no, because of the last 4 years we've had, so many more people care than they used to. And you know this as well as I do. Like the number of people that have cared about public defenders running for prosecutor, that have cared, that have taken to the streets in an uprising against police violence, that have, you know, taken action as opposed to just sending thoughts and prayers and like tweets and likes. This has been a 4 years of hell, but it's also been a 4 years of getting ready to do better and fight smarter, and also inspiring young people. We heard from Zach yesterday. You know, the young people are fired up too. So I think we should end on a note of hope, because at the very least, if we have to continue the fight, and continue we will, at least now we're fighting with a lot more people involved in this fight than we ever had before.
All right. Well, I hope everybody stays involved.
Yeah,
That's
keep
the real.
watching the show.
Keep watching, keep fighting, because we have a long way to go, but we have the masses assembled.
Yeah, and if we have, I mean, honestly, let's just remember, if there is a landslide Joe Biden victory that we find out about on Tuesday, that has been brewing this whole time secretly, that we learn about on Tuesday, none of these fears need to come to pass, and we can focus on putting safeguards in place that will prevent us from ever being this sustainedly freaked out ever again. So don't mail your ballot in, take it in by hand.
Bring it.
Yeah. And call friends, call 3, I don't care who you call 3 random people you might just want to catch up with for no reason, and check on them and see if they voted and how.
And
tell
if
them
not,
everything you learned.
drag them.
Yeah. All right. So that's our show. We hope you all have a wonderful, safe Halloween pandemic weekend. If you can avoid being consumed by anxiety, or just make that somehow into part of your costume. We will be back on Monday at 4 p.m., of course. And if you are already thinking ahead to November 3rd, I have really good news for you. You can join us here for our election night coverage with me and Alana and all of our wonderful friends. We will be going live from 7 p.m. until who knows when, maybe forever. Maybe we just live here now. I don't know. But you should join us and find out. It's going to be a lot more fun than any of the normal TV stuff. So we will see you here on Monday. That's The Count. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is Alana